Hi, I'm Travis. I'm the curator of Indigenous History and Culture for the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. We're here at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown to discuss the American Indians' participation in the Revolutionary War. For Indigenous peoples, the American Revolution was perhaps one of the worst events to ever befall Indigenous nations. While patriots fought for independence from Great Britain in the East, the American Revolution was also a war of conquest against Indigenous nations in the West, and indeed was throughout the course of the war also an Indian war. The American Revolution would have devastating effects for Native communities. It would cause dislocation, it would cause refugee crisis, it would cause, in some instances, civil war. It would cause intra-tribal conflict while Native peoples were trying to adapt and adjust to ever-changing circumstances and ongoing threats to their sovereignty and to their lands. At the beginning of the American Revolution, American Indian nations were equally divided in their support. About one-third supported the British in their fight against the American colonies, about one-third supported the American cause for independence, and one-third tried to remain neutral, but neutrality was an option that quickly dissipated as the war progressed. Native peoples found that they had to make a decision to support one side or the other. A great example of that would be the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast. When the war began, the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras put their support behind the American cause, while the Senecas and the Mohawks and the Cayugas supported the British in their fight against the Americans. And this caused a civil war among the Iroquois Confederacy. And at the Battle of Oriskany, Iroquoian peoples literally fought brother against brother in some instances. Because of their divided allegiances during the American Revolution, for the first time since the beginning of the Confederacy, the ritual fire that had been kept at Onondaga was extinguished. While the Iroquois are an example of civil war among Native nations during the Revolution, most Native nations saw division because of their divided allegiances. Among the Cherokee, you had a split in leadership. The older leaders counseled moderation, while the younger warriors, led by Dragon Canoe, wanted to fight as British allies against the encroaching Americans. Now, this would all explode in 1776 as Dragon Canoe and some of his followers attacked the encroaching settlements in the Carolinas and in Georgia. This led to a retaliation against the Cherokee in 1776 that was devastating. 3 expeditions, 2 from the Carolinas and 1 from Virginia, burnt several Cherokee towns, burnt their crops, and caused a refugee crisis, with Cherokee people fleeing to the south among their Creek and Chickasaw neighbors. There were many military campaigns against Indigenous nations that were devastating. In 1776, the Cherokee were attacked by the Carolinians and the Virginians, but in the Northeast, to punish those Iroquois allies of the British, General Washington sent General John Sullivan on a scorched earth campaign into Iroquois. And Sullivan's campaign destroyed several towns, burned all the crops, and caused a refugee crisis, sending Iroquois people fleeing to their neighbors and to the British outposts. One of the objects that we have here at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown that speaks to Native diplomacy during the American Revolution is this string of wampum. Now, wampum were beads made from the quahaug clamshell and the whelk shell, purple and white. Wampum was used in diplomacy among Indigenous nations and between Indigenous nations and Europeans. The string of wampum that we have here on display at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown is a string that was given by the Shawnee leader Cornstalk to the young militant Cherokee leader Dragon Canoe in 1776, as the Shawnee and some of the other Ohio Indians were seeking Cherokee support against the encroaching Americans. So wampum belts and strings were used in diplomacy. In particular, wampum strings, like the one we have here on display, were used during speeches, so that when a speaker wanted to validate a point that had just been made, they would make that point and they would give or present a string of wampum. So that if I were speaking and I wanted to validate what I just said as true and add emphasis to what I just said, afterwards I would present a string of wampum. Now when Cornstalk went among the Cherokee in 1776 to solicit their partnership and their alliance, this string was one of 4 that was presented, which meant that during the speech, Cornstalk presented 4 strings to the Cherokee to validate the points he was making. So several American Indian people fought as allies of the Americans during the Revolution. One great example of that is Robert Mursh, a Pamunkey tribal member from here in Virginia. Robert Mursh enlisted in the Continental Army and fought in major battles throughout the Revolution. Outside of Charleston, South Carolina, he was captured and spent 14 months as a prisoner of war. After his release, he fought at the Siege of Yorktown with other indigenous allies. While many indigenous peoples were allies of the Americans, Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, categorically referred to them as, quote, merciless Indian savages, end quote, even though they had fought for the independence of the new nation. One of the most devastating things about the American Revolution for indigenous nations was its aftermath. The Americans' victory in gaining their independence began the era of aggressive expansionism to the West, the beginnings of manifest destiny, so that those indigenous nations who fought as allies to the British were seen by the new Americans as allies of tyranny, and therefore their treatment was justified. The middle ground of diplomacy that had maintained relationships with indigenous peoples for centuries was over. There will be no more speeches, there will be no more wampum given, and the protocols for diplomacy were dictated by the Americans solely. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.